Okay, welcome back. Day 2 of our Zoom session, our hybrid meeting. It's great to have everyone in person in this room. We went around earlier, so our Zoom participants could see, and welcome to everyone who's following us streaming. Today, the topic is ISO 240, our fraud standard, and our project proposal. And so Lynn will walk through the project proposal and ask for comments on the matters for our consideration as it's set out in issues paper agenda 3. The goal is ultimately to get comments to inform a final project proposal that will be approved next Monday, or that's the intent. So it's just worth reflecting on this journey that we are on fraud, and also to some extent going concern, which followed right behind, because this really is a new process that we're adopting here, that following our adoption of the framework for activities, it's more evidence-based. We're following or incorporating the elements of the PIF, the public interest framework, which incidentally is not meant to be taken word for word and match things line item and a checkbox approach. It's meant to be a mindset to be adopted and focusing on what interests are to be served, who's going to be served properly by our development of a standard of public interest, and what are the qualitative issues, elements that we're taking from the framework to incorporate in our standard setting. So, you know, we got a number of comments back through this about how the PIF relates to the project proposal. The fear is that we will take a rote exercise. That's not the intent. It's really about focusing on how the public interest will be served in a variety of ways, and how we're going to hold ourselves accountable going forward. I think that this document reflects a lot of research and work that we've done. It's really driven by the evidence that we've received. One of the temptations we've always had over time has been to jump into the standard setting. So a lot of comments are been really useful, but there is an element of trying to frame issues towards conclusions, when in truth, the hard work will really get started once the project proposal is approved, where we will adopt an open-minded, evidence-based approach to reaching conclusions. So with that in mind, you know, I really think we're really focused on today. Have we identified the issues we've heard appropriately through our consultation? Have we identified the public interest objectives to be served through this project? And have we been comprehensive in the list of issues to address, to answer those public interest objectives that we've set out? And I think we could spend a lot of time fighting over whether we use the word consider, examine, enhance, strengthen. But the reality is that we want to make sure that we're comprehensive in our approach if we're going to serve the public interest. So those are things that I had in mind. The good thing is, from what I saw, there's a lot of comments that we received, but in general, I think the direction is supported. But that's what we'll have a conversation today, and we'll ultimately get approval, hopefully based upon the input we received today on Monday, and we'll see where it goes. But Lynn, congratulations to you, the working group, and the staff for getting us to this point, and I really look forward to a robust conversation today.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I've just said it in the indigenous language of our country. Greetings, thrice greetings to you all. And I do bring warm wishes from New Zealand. I'd like to start by acknowledging that so far we've been on an 18-month planning journey. I know that isn't as long as your 6-year 600 journey, Len, but it certainly has been a comprehensive planning process. And before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the particular people who have been part of that journey. Fiona Campbell oversaw the initial information gathering part in 2020. She worked with staff on that, and in 2021, the working group was established with Julie, Lynn, Diane, supported by Denise, Imran, and Fabian. We have been very well supported by the staff, namely Bev, Hankin, Angela, and I'd just like to pause on Angela for a moment, because she did a lot of the heavy lifting when it came to the root cause analysis and in gathering the information that has been put in the draft project proposal. And anticipating the future, I'd like to welcome to the project Sally Ann and Jasper, who will be staff members going forward as Bev moves on to better and greater things. So today we're going to do two things: have a quick overview of the activities that we've done since the last board meeting, and then go through the project proposal. Before we get into the presentation, I'd like to pause on two issues. The first one is the PIOB public interests list, which was updated on November the 10th, and all of those issues have been included in the project proposal. In particular, I'd like to highlight the importance they put on strengthening the auditor's responsibilities within 240, and also in relation to the identification and reporting of fraud. Last week we had a meeting of CAG, and I will give you a briefing of the detail on that CAG meeting, but I wondered before we started if I didn't turn to Jim to give us an overview of it in his words, and then I will continue with the presentation. Jim, is that all right?
Lynn, that sounds great. Thank you. And we did have a CAG meeting that was specific to the fraud project. And the way we viewed this, it was in context of whether or not this would be a project that we would advise to go forward on. And so that was really the nature of our discussion. It was a higher level discussion, a strategic discussion. And where we ended up, we had very strong support for moving forward with the project. And I just completed my report to the PIOB. And in that, I said that we did strongly support that. And so hopefully the board will be able to work through and support the project moving forward, because it is important from a CAG perspective. So I'll stop there, Lynn, but I'll just give you that overview.
Thank you very much, Jim, and we will get on to the detail of that discussion as we move through. Next slide, please. Okay, as Tom has said, the discussion today is on the project proposal, specifically the issues paper 3, and the draft proposal, which is in 3A, and moving forward to next week to project approval. Since the July meeting, we have, as was requested by respondents to the discussion paper, done additional root cause analysis, and a summary of the findings and key takeaways from this work are discussed in the slides that follow. Then the working group developed an overall analysis and to the project proposal, that is the agenda item 3B, and that is a comprehensive view of each of the themes, what we initially as a working group recommended, what then the board decided in the 3 discussions we had, and it includes what we have now put in the draft project proposal. In addition to that, we have included the additional root cause analysis as that relates to the issues. Papers 3B and 3C are background papers and won't be discussed during this plenary session, except as they relate to the project proposal. After this meeting, we'll update the draft, taking into account not only your comments at this meeting, but also the offline written comments that we have received. And I'd like to thank everybody who sent those written comments through. We will take each one of them seriously. And then we will move towards the approval process. Next slide, please. Okay, to give a context to the additional root cause analysis, between March 2020 and March 2021, we did significant information gathering and research. And it's within that context that we looked at the additional root cause analysis. In that root cause analysis, we targeted stakeholders with who had extensive knowledge of the nature of specific frauds. We also did academic research of recent fraud cases, and we did other research where there were reports of publicly available information. I think it's worth noting that some of the recent higher profile fraud cases are still going through the litigation process, so we couldn't get a lot of detail, but staff did look at what was publicly available and used that in terms of the analysis. The findings of the root cause analysis further substantiates and reinforces the objectives and scope of the project. And we'll talk more about the findings from the additional work in the next slide. If we can move on to that slide, please. Okay, these are the common themes from the additional root cause analysis. Staff met with a variety of individuals, some representing police commissioners, audit oversight authorities, and firms, often with the individuals who had global roles. We haven't named them in the document because we said we would not identify them or attribute comments to them. The 8 items on the slides are the common views across all of the individuals. Although there were some jurisdictional differences, we found that we had broad themes that were largely similar. And the key takeaways were each fraud is unique and often complex, and there are often many contributing factors. Issues relating to fraud will need to be addressed through a combined standard setting efforts of the IAASB, as well as action from all participants in the financial reporting ecosystem. Very importantly, corporate culture and internal controls are key aspects of fraud prevention and detection. Exercise of professional skepticism and identifying red flags is critical, and non-material fraud and third-party frauds are issues that merit further consideration as changes are made to the standard. Frauds often start small but grow into material frauds. Those were, from our perspective, the key findings, which should be familiar to you all. I just note the last one, they were issues that initially we had determined that we would do nothing more on, but they came back into the frame through the root cause analysis, and I'm sure people will have opinions on that. Moving on to the next slide. We've already had an overview from Jim on the CAG session. Let me put a little more detail into that. The feedback was extremely valuable and fell into these 6 areas, plus some, of course. In terms of roles and responsibilities, CAG representatives emphasised the need to focus on what the auditor is required to do, rather than describing the roles and responsibilities in terms of what they are not going to do. On professional scepticism, representatives emphasised the importance of focusing on professional scepticism throughout the audit. On transparency, the focus on transparency was welcomed, in particular with those charged with governance. It was suggested to think more about the impact when those charged with governance do not react to issues that could lead to frauds, and gave a suggestion that we might like to look at the steps in the transparency process and consider a decision tree in that regard. The 4th issue is technology in the bottom blue box. Observations made included that it's important to address both aspects of technology in the revised standard: the use of technology when frauds are perpetrated, as well as the use of technology by the auditor to undertake their audit work, that is, perform audit procedures. Moving on to the black box, representatives encouraged the IAASB to consider developing criteria as to when fraud specialists need to be involved. And finally, scalability. Says I've already talked about the ecosystem. I just want to add scalability. Caution that the slide needs to make sure that any new requirements are scalable. The CAG also highlighted the need to stay abreast of any global developments, in particular staying attuned to the views of stakeholders, being aware of judicial standard setting activities. For example, in Japan and Netherlands were noted specifically, and there was also reference to the soon to be released COSO framework. Coming back to the ecosystem, representatives noted that the IAASB doing their part to modernise, enhance and strengthen ISA 240 will further assist with closing the perceived delivery gap for auditors, assuming the proper implementation of the standard. The IAASB was also encouraged to consider old procedures in the current standards that may not be needed as the standard is updated. Discussion also revolved around the importance of clarifying through other activities, including activities of an educational nature or actions of others in the financial reporting ecosystem, that the standard setting actions of the IAASB address only one aspect of the delivery gap and encourage complementary actions by others. So as you can see, that was a very comprehensive and interesting discussion, and I'll just call on Jim again in case I've missed anything or there's anything he particularly wishes to emphasise. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Lynn. I think of the areas we discussed, probably the one that had the most support was in the role and responsibilities, specifically having the auditor say what they were responsible for versus what they were not responsible for.
Yeah. Thanks, Jim. I think that's very true. It's one of our lead issues, and it's certainly a theme that has come through from a lot of consultation. Moving to the next slide, and the penultimate piece of feedback. Many of the boxes on this slide will be familiar because they are similar topics to what you've already heard about, but there are a few differences. The SMP advisory group has sent us a letter which was circulated this morning. I'll just provide you a summary of what it said. There was general support for the direction of the changes, and they had some broad observations. There's support for clarifying the roles and responsibility of the auditor regarding fraud, including examining and explaining the inherent limitations so that the expectations are clear. So they balance both together. In terms of the definition of fraud and the use of forensic skills, there was support for clarifying how bribery and corruption relate to the definition of fraud, and are of the view that these fall under ISA 250 revised, but that the linkages to 240 should be made clear. They also supported exploring the use of forensic procedures on audit, but cautioned that scalability needed to be addressed for SMPs in a practical manner. On professional scepticism, there was support for not pursuing a suspicious mind, but rather reinforcing more robust exercise of professional scepticism when performing procedures relating to fraud. And there was support for non-authoritative guidance illustrating the ramping up of procedures when a fraud is identified or suspected, and the provision of practical examples of professional scepticism in such circumstances. On transparency, while there was overall support for the project objectives to achieve the public interest, there was a concern about how to enhance the transparency of fraud-related procedures, especially with respect to the appropriateness of adopting the UK approach for reporting on fraud in the audit report on a global basis, unless there are clear measures in place whereby management's responsibility with respect to fraud are also defined. The auditor should not be held responsible where management is not. And agreement within the SMP advisory group that the fraud working group should more fully explore and clarify the interaction of key audit matters and fraud-related matters. On fraud procedures, there was support for clarifying what needs to be done when the fraud is identified or suspected, and noted concern for auditors possibly making false accusations based on suspicions that specifically do not result in court action. There was also support for clarifying how to consider unpredictability when performing audit procedures, noting the difficulty in this regard, given the requirement to discuss the audit approach with those charged with governance may in some instances be the same as management. Non-material fraud and third-party fraud. There was support for explaining the auditor's actions when non-material fraud is suspected or identified, and there was support for clarifying the auditor's responsibilities with respect to third-party fraud and third-party collusion. The other comments were caution that messaging on the potential impact of the project should not be overplayed, given the way that sophisticated frauds can evolve such that no real patterns are clear. And also a caution to be careful not to imply that the revisions to the ISAs alone will provide solutions, or that auditors can do more than currently required by the standards, that is, contribute to the widening of the expectation delivery gap. And finally, they talked about the importance of involving other stakeholders within the financial reporting ecosystem, as each participant has a role in contributing to high quality financial reporting. So as you can see, we got some very comprehensive feedback and supportive feedback from the SMP advisory group, and I thank them for it. Moving on to the next slide of feedback from the board's written comments. These we have structured more in terms of the structure of the project proposal, because that was the nature of the comments that came through. And before I move forward, can I thank all the board members again for that feedback. And I know that you will raise the important comments that you think are important during the session. Can you be assured that the working group is taking your written feedback very seriously, and we will look at each and every comment carefully. That doesn't mean we will accept each and every comment, but we will consider it carefully. If I can just give a flavour of the comments, I'm sure you will expand on them as we go through. In terms of the overall structure, there was broad support of the structure and how the public interest framework is built into the proposal, but some detailed comments through on specific matters. There were various comments about the level of specificity, particularly around the proposed actions. Some wanted more specificity, and others thought it needed to be more open. So I'm sure that will be something we work through. There were comments in various places around the role of others in the ecosystem and how it needed to be clear what is needed to narrow the expectation gap. And there were comments on the interaction between paragraphs 18 and 23, that more clarification is needed in paragraph 18 in terms of the description of the issues, and paragraph 23 in terms of proposed actions. And also need to make sure that all the issues correspond to the proposed actions and vice versa. In the project objectives, comments about linking project objectives to the public interest. As Tom's already talked about, preferences in terms of the choice of words, whether you want enhance, strengthen or consider, and more clarity around the professional skepticism and transparency objectives. In terms of the stakeholders, there were changes called for in the how the stakeholders were described. These were taken as a quote from the PIF, and it is our intention, unless I hear something compelling and put it to the work group, that we leave these as they are. They are a direct quote from the PIF. And in fact, as a general rule, what is in the PIF is quoted as such. There was also people asking for more around how stakeholders' input was weighed, and I'll come to more on that. there were many comments around paragraph 18 that looked for changes to how the key issues are described. I just like to note that people did not debate the issue, they discussed how it was described. On the impact of the proposal, there were some editorial suggestions and enhancement. Some people had a concern on the timeline, and others had a concern in terms of non-authoritative guidance, and I will come back to the changes we made in that regard. So that at a high level is the feedback that we received from the board. Next slide, please. Okay, you have already seen everything that's on this slide because it's in the draft project proposal. This is the first time we're comprehensively taking the board through our new framework for activities, and it will be interesting to debrief what's gone well and what hasn't as the first ones through this process. It's also the first time we've used the public interest framework, and whilst it is not yet effective, it will be by the time we complete this project, and that's why we have incorporated it in the project. It's important to get the board's comments, not just on 240, but also any comments, and you can make these in session or maybe offline, about the structure that we've put forward, because it's likely to be the blueprint used for project proposals going forward. Next slide, please. Okay, because the PIF is such an important part of the structure and content of the plan, I'm going to hand to Bev, who's just going to provide a little bit more detail in terms of the framework and how we've used it. Over to you, Bev.
Thanks, Lynn, and hello, everyone. We did receive quite a lot of comments throughout the project proposal in various areas where we've tried to build in the PIF. So we just wanted to sort of remind you of what the PIF is and what its purpose is. So effectively, the PIF articulates the public interest responsiveness of a proposed project, and we've tailored that for the fraud project. It sets out the considerations of the judgments that are needed, remembering that a lot of the things that we do are related to judgment. So as Lynn alluded to, the PIF is not operational. Many of the things, though, that are in the PIF, we probably do anyway, the way that we currently do our projects. But there are elements that we will need to think a little bit more about as we progress in this project, and the PIF does come into play in our processes. So there's certain things that we will need to look at as we go along, and we'll need to build the elements in. For example, how we deal with the qualitative characteristics and on an ongoing basis. So how do we build that into our task force meetings, and how do we build that into our issues papers, and at what points in time do we report back to the board on our considerations around some of these matters? We also had quite a number of comments around the way that we weigh the comments against the criteria, which comes directly out of the PIF. And on that, we probably do that today. I think we look at the comments, we consider all of the comments, we make an effort to try and get comments from as many stakeholders, in particular certain stakeholders, and then we do weigh those comments on merit. I think the PIF is not new in that aspect. We've now built it into the project proposal, but the way that that's done may evolve as we go through all of these big substantial projects that we're starting at the moment. So the way that the PIF is implemented into our processes may change some of what we do. So we don't plan to articulate any further within this project proposal some of the ways that we may do this. However, we do recognize that there were a number of comments in this area, and we will put some more contextual paragraphs around some of this just to explain it and where we are in the PIF. So we just wanted to highlight that because there are a number of comments in this area. So with that, Lynn, I'll hand back to you.
Thanks very much, Bev. Next slide, please. Moving now from the input we have received and a summary of that to the project proposal content. The first area I want to cover are the project objectives. And you will notice that the 4 project objectives align extremely closely with the feedback we have received of what's important, and also with the PIF. They are in fact derived from the needs that need to be served. They also relate to the stakeholders' needs, that's the public interest, and they cover a significant, all of the issues that we think need to be covered in this project. The first one being roles and responsibilities, then moving on to the area where we had unanimity about risk assessment procedures and responses, through to professional skepticism and transparency. Next slide, please. The stakeholders that are impacted by this project are many and varied, and we have used the PIF description, as I have already said. In soliciting the input from stakeholders, the project has and will continue throughout the life cycle of the project to use the current IAAS procedures and framework for determining stakeholder input and how we deal with it. First of all, we consider all input from different stakeholders that affect the overall objectives that we want to achieve in the public interest. Secondly, we appropriately weigh the input in terms of public interest impact of the relative stakeholder interests, with a focus, of course, on the users of financial statements. And then we appropriately balance alternative outcomes in terms of the expected responsiveness to the public interest. Some people have asked us how we've done that. That has been absolutely how every project goes through in terms of the IAASB, and of course involves professional judgment. So with that, moving on to the next slide, we are seeking your input, first of all, on the overall structure of the project proposal. This is about the overall structure and content. We will get to the detailed actions later on in the session, so please hold your comments on those, please, until that time. We will take all 3 items together if we can, Tom. So can I hand it back to you to start the questions or get any other input?
Thank you, Lynn, and thanks for the overview. So these are sort of the broader questions that are being asked today. And I'd like to hear from as many of you that are not on the working group as possible on this topic, even if it's saying that you are in support, because supported for the public record. So I'll take show of hands right now, or name tags. Who would like to go first? Maybe I'll just do it this way. Yes?
Sorry, Tom, before we start, it might be useful to get any comments James has on the PIF while people are thinking of their questions.
Okay, and then I will call on Fernando first.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Lynn. Just a couple of reflections, I guess, ahead of the conversation, and I've of course been very interested and closely involved in the expectations of the PIF and how it's being transformative to our process, even at this piloting stage. And I think we just need to recognize that this is a part of the stage of the journey. I think first of all, and I think Bez articulated it quite well, I'll just remind the focus. The PIF is actually concerned with the entirety of the process. And I think the project proposal is an important element, but really just one element of the process. And I think what we've signaled within our intentions for the project, and I think quite clearly in the project proposal, is that we are bringing in the elements of discussion throughout the stages of the project development. Meaning at the task force level, as Bev has suggested, into the board's deliberations, the accountabilities back during the deliberations, into the exposure draft, and so forth. Secondly, there is a document that has been developed, which we call the operating procedures, and this was developed during the transition discussions and jointly agreed with the SSB chairs, the PIOB, and the monitoring group team. And this project proposal is very much aligned with those operating procedures, which had a principal focus of outlining how to operationalize the PIF into a project proposal and indeed into the other elements. So I think the board should just have the assurance that what is presented is very much aligned with what at the PIOB and monitoring group level envisioned in terms of how to begin operationalizing. Finally, I think we'll only know whether we've got this project proposal precisely right in hindsight. Again, I think we will learn as we move through the process. So my advice, I think, in terms of acknowledging the contribution that the PIF has made to the shaping of the project proposal, I think the focus should principally be on whether the project proposal is clear in its scoping and its priorities and appropriately guiding. So I guess I'd like to just leave that level of assurance with the board as you consider the project proposal as a whole.
Okay, I'm a man of my word. Fernando.
Thanks, Tom. And Lane, I have to admit that the paper is very well structured. I hate having long papers to read for the board because you think it will be difficult to digest and you will need to read once, twice. But this one, actually, it's quite easy to follow. I like a lot the tables. I think the visuals help a lot really to understand the issues, the responses, course of action, and how it linked to the rest of the paper. And that makes it quite easy to digest and understand what is going to happen. In general terms, I think it includes all the issues that we have discussed in previous board meetings, well summarized, and very supportive in general terms how it was presented.
Thank you, Fernando. Josephine.
Thank you, Tom. First of all, thanks to Lynn, Bev, and the working group for all the hard work that's gone into this. I think it's an excellent paper, similar to Fernando. I think the overall structure and content is extremely high quality. So thank you for that. Generally, on the questions that you're asking, just standing back, just a couple of general points. As you raised in your presentation, Lynn, there were some concerns at our end about the amount of detail of the project proposal, but actually I was fairly comfortable with it. I think what underlined the concerns there was the flexibility in scope. I understand that we have to be very careful of scope creep. It's something we talk about very often in our projects. But at the same time, we have to build in some flexibility because as we're working through the process in building the revisions to the standard and creating the non-authoritative guidance and so forth, we may find matters that we do need to address which we may find that there are matters that do need to be addressed that might actually lead to a little bit more standard setting slightly outside what we've written here. So we shouldn't, I don't mind the detail, but provided we have something in there that makes sure that there is flexibility in the scope, notwithstanding we're not talking about scope creep here. The only other sort of big point that came back from our outreach was around the timeline, which again is another matter that you pointed out. Now, this is tricky for me because I've been on 600 and 600 was 6 years. I know very well how long these projects take. It's a lot of work and we have to go through a due process and we have to deliver a quality project. So I understand that there are other projects as well that we have to do and we only have so much resource and so much time. However, if there is any scope for bringing that timeline forward, that would be great. This is a key public interest issue globally. And even if there isn't, I think we do have to manage the expectations of our stakeholders. 600, for example, was delayed. And so that led to it being a 6-year project, longer to some extent. So just making sure that we do manage the expectations, because I'm sure some of our stakeholders will be expecting something to be turned around fairly quickly. So if you could bear that in mind, I'd be most grateful. And then on the project objectives, happy with those. And whether the interests that need to be served within the PIF, I think I'm happy with those as well. So thank you, and thanks again to the working group.
Thanks, Josephine. A couple of things following on those comments. On the timeline issue, I'm certain we're going to come back to that point in detail later, right? As part of it, we've heard that a couple of times. So I don't mind people mentioning it right now, but I'm expecting a more fulsome discussion later in the session. I think it's really an important point about the issues and how much we stick to it, because my assumption has always been when we provide this level of detail is that this is based upon what we had identified our public interest objectives of the project at this point, our best estimate based upon the evidence we have before us today and the deliberations that we've had, how we're going to address those public interests. But they are, of course, not etched in stone, and that our deliberations at the board table or at the task force level may lead us into new areas, but with some discipline around scope. But I don't know if I think it's an important topic and sort of a mutual understanding that we need to come to. But is that more or less how other people understand the issues? Is that how I guess I should ask Bev or Lynn, is that how they were drafted in your mind too?
Absolutely, Tom. That's how we thought about it. You need a level of specificity, but the world doesn't stay still. So things change, things move, you get better information, you do different things, and so you do need some flexibility. So we were trying to do both. We may have to actually explain that a little bit more clearly in the project proposal up front so people have that context.
Right. So we're not held too formally to the list today. But this would be something we'd certainly, as you give your general comments, we'd invite input too. But that's sort of what I've been taking as a working hypothesis on the list of issues in front of us. Okay, so let me call out Kaiue.
Good evening. Thank you, Tom. And I have 3 brief comments. And first of all, then let me thank you to you and your working group and the staff which stands behind. As I have mentioned, I have 3 little comments. First of all, as Fernando has also mentioned, I'm in favor of the overall structure of the draft project proposal, except for some editorial wording changes that I have provided offline to the working group. I'm also in favor of the proposed project objectives. And I also believe that the interests that need to be serviced within the public interest framework have been appropriately incorporated. That's all. Lynn, thanks very much. Back to you, Tom.
Thanks, Kai. Sachiko?
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Tom. And first of all, thank you very much, Lee, and your task force. I think the draft is very responsive to what we discussed previously. So I support the overall direction. And I have 2 comments relating to ecosystem. So please allow me to comment on this matter because they do not necessarily only relate to one specific paragraph in the draft. Firstly, I strongly agree that the fraud-related issue need to be addressed through combined effort in the standard setting by IAASB, as well as action from all participants in the ecosystem. So I really appreciate that the draft incorporate the combined effort with other participants. But I think it could be more emphasized than the current description. One suggestion I have is it's a sort of specific paragraph, but last sentence in paragraph 22, which state other actions are not the core focus of the project proposed scope. And I totally agree that our mandate is not standard. Our mandate is on standard setting, and it is our core, but I think this sentence may give an unnecessary negative impression about the other actions. In addition, I think we can a little bit expand on maybe in paragraph 27 about why it is important for all stakeholders in the ecosystem to be involved. For example, I think the discussion paper explained that our effort will necessarily require us to work with others in ecosystem because the effectiveness of any potential changes may depend partly on the action of other stakeholders. And I think this point can be added in the project proposal as well. And my second comment relates to my first comment as well. I think the importance of collaborative effort is also relevant in the standard setting action, because I think the provision that stipulate the auditor's responsibility based on the role of other participants would be more effective than the provision that just talks about auditor's responsibility. One very simple example is that rather than simply saying that auditor shall communicate with those charged with governance specific information, I think it will be more powerful to say that auditor shall communicate with them specific information so that they play their role. As such, I think it is important that we also recognize the importance of the collaborative effort and the linkage between our role and roles of other participants in the ecosystem in the ongoing standard setting project. This is maybe not something that we need to change the project proposal, but I think it is something that is very important in our ongoing deliberation. That's all for me. Thank you, Tom, and back to you.
Thank you, Sachiko. Roger.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn, and thanks to the working group. A great job, very supportive of what we've got in front of us. In fact, I've talked to a couple of chairs of national standard setters, and I think you are setting up the pro forma. We've got to do the same area of putting out project proposals and incorporating public interest, and I think you are setting up a pro forma. So I think this is a pro forma going forward as to how you incorporate the public interest. I do not take what you've got in a project proposal as etched in stone, and I don't think you need to make that clear. This is a project proposal bringing forward, and there will be work that's done. There'll be stages along the process where decisions will be made, and they need to be made clear, but I don't think you need to do that. And I do believe that all the interests are served. So supportive that you probably won't hear a lot from me because we don't have a lot of comments on this particular area. So congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Sue.
Thank you, and thanks, Lynn and the team. Like others, I'm supportive of this. It's an incredibly important project. We've sent you a few comments and suggestions, but they are they're suggestions for considerations, and there's nothing that is major there. In relation to the questions that you've asked on the slide, I think the structure is excellent and conveys
really well what we intend to do. And I also don't take this as being set in stone, but it's more like setting a direction. In relation to the objectives, just on D, it references reporting requirements, and I wonder whether it would be helpful there maybe to just explain a little bit more about what we mean there, you know, who it's to and what the kind of mechanisms are, because I think that can be read in different ways. In relation to the need to be served, your explanation about sticking to the PIF verbatim, I think was very helpful. I did highlight there's a reference in the profession to the use of ISAs, and that includes accountants in business. And I wondered, in the context of the PIF, I think that applies to ethical standards as well. And of course, there are sections there. So I did wonder whether that might be something just to look at in the context of ISAs. And I was also surprised not to see tax authorities in that list of users, because I think in the context of audited financial statements, that's quite important. And then the only other comment I got was the root cause analysis that you did, I thought was incredibly helpful. And I just think we should make sure that's not lost. It felt like a very valuable piece of educational material, whether it's IAASB or others or what have you, but very supportive, Lynn. Thank you very much for a great job.
Thank you, Sue. Chun-Li.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you so much, Lynn, to you, to your working group and staff. I must say, like others, I really enjoy reading the papers. I read it on my way here, actually, 16 hours flight in between sleep and eat. It was my only source of entertainment. It was a very engaging and I must say interesting read. So thanks so much for that. I'm very supportive of the direction, supportive of the project proposal. I sent through my comments, and as appropriate, I may raise some of the points later on, but most of them are really just recommendations and suggestions for the working group to consider. I had a comment on the way, I don't know, is it PIF or PERF gets reflected in the paper, but I take comfort in the way it was explained earlier, and that more contextual information will be provided. So I think I'll be happy with that. I did take a pause in terms of the details of the proposed actions, but going through it again, I find it helpful, and again, I take comfort in the earlier discussion that it's not cast in stone. So I think this is really helpful in guiding the working group and going to be task force in scoping the work. But I think, to Josephine's point, the flexibility needs to be there. So again, I think that's great. So nothing more to add. I'm supportive of A, B, and C. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chun-Li. I don't know if that's a reflection on the quality of Hollywood films that are available to watch on your flight from Singapore, but I'm glad you enjoyed the project proposal as much as I had. Isabel.
Yes, hello everybody. Good evening from Paris. I also enjoyed reading the paper. It's quite clear and maybe less over-engineered as some previous paper we had on this project. So it's really straightforward, and we have a temptation to jump immediately in the debate around the project. Maybe an idea, there is a lot of duplication, of course, between paragraph 18 and paragraph 23, and maybe there would be an interest to keep at the same place the key issues, the details of the key issues, and then in front of the details of the key issues, the details of the proposed action. So I had the idea that maybe we could combine everything in a big schedule and have the detail of the issues in front of the detail of the proposed action, because I believe it would help to assess if the proposed actions will respond to the detailed key issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Pam Martin.
thank you. And thank you, Lynn, working group and staff that's been working on this paper. Although it's on the long side, it provides really good structure and shows a good resume of all the issues and the proposed actions. I think it, as others said, it provides good direction for the soon-to-be task force on the work going to be performed, and also to me, it allows for the flexibility of issues and the proposed actions that we're going forward. So very supportive on direction, and thanks. Job well done.
Thank you. Imran.
Thank you, and really good evening, everybody, and good evening, Chairman Lynn and the working group. This project has really weighed on my mind over the last 2 weeks. We've spent a lot of time reading and studying it, and amongst public interest issues, this for some of us is really the paramount issue at the moment. It's what makes the newspaper headlines every week. And where our attention is very well focused. I really want to appreciate your efforts on the papers, especially on the proposed structure. I found the structure works really well. As I spent more and more time on the papers, I found, Lynn, the possibility that the answers to the things I was looking for in agenda item 3A, I found them in agenda item 3 and vice versa. And you'll see that coming through even in the way I provide responses now. And so I just make the point that it seemed as if some of the issues paper matters actually belonged in the project proposal. And where they didn't, there were some unexplained differences between them, which you may want to look into. I have sent in comprehensive comments, especially because so much here is new, seeing this issues paper in this format. And so there is a significant amount to comment on, but also because if you're, as I make these comments, there is then just a written record of what it is, so you don't have to stress about getting it all down. I really appreciated your comment in the introduction, Len, where you reassured the board that you will consider and listen to all the comments that have come in prior to the start of this meeting. But I have this request that as you do so, you may get a sense of deja vu about some of the comments that you may have seen them before. I've tried as much as possible to link back some of my comments to previous board discussions and previous board decisions, or provided a suitable extract from the minute, at least as I read it. And so as you reflect on the inputs that you receive, I've also, where possible, tried to link it back to feedback that we got from the discussion paper. After all, that was the purpose of the discussion paper, and provided some statistics from the discussion paper afresh. It's been a long time, and I had myself forgotten some of the detail, so I had my staff dig it up. And also, of course, a reflection on the stakeholder groups represented in those discussion paper responses and represented in our board conversation. I was intrigued by the promise that there would be some attention given to how inputs from different stakeholders would be weighted. But I think in that comment, you were reflecting on how it would be weighted post the approval of the project proposal. And I'd like to urge you, Lynn, to also reflect on how they're weighted in the process of approving the project proposal. So we already have monitoring group inputs. We already have PIOB inputs. Those inputs are relevant today for the project proposal. Over the next 18 months, there will be fresh inputs about individual issues. And of course, they need to be weighted at that point. But I want to just make the point that there's two different perspectives about how, two different times when we reflect on this. The second general comment I want to make is about this 18 months that have already elapsed since the start of the establishment of the working group. And the reason we have set aside so much of time is because we have taken a very deliberate and long process on the fraud working group to get to this point. We've had the consultation, discussion papers, all the fora that you have described in the research that you have done. And I would have expected that the purpose of that large investment is to help. Yes.
This connection stopped for about 30 seconds.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll repeat that.
I'm sorry.
Thanks, Tom.
Where we lost you was where you would expect talking about weighting these inputs for the PIOB and the MG.
Okay,
at
great.
the point of project proposal. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you. So then moving on to the second question was about the period of time that it has taken us to get to the project proposal today. We have invested a solid 18 months of working group time and board time on this. And we have done an extensive amount of work. The DP just being one of them, the amount of research reflected in your attachments, the number of outreach events you've had around this is really extensive. And I think this is very, very different to some projects we undertook recently. So I compared this to the project proposal on ISA 315 and found that it was really not comparable, the amount of work that's already been done versus the amount of work that was done in that type of a project. So one would hope, Lynn, that the reason we did all of this work was for us to get very confident steers about the range of issues and about the direction of play on those issues. And so when I read the project proposal together with issues paper, I felt like on a number of issues where we have heard repeatedly confident voices direct us, we may be taking a step back to say, well, we're going to relitigate this during the standard setting phase. Now, either that's intentional or there's just a wrong choice of words in the issues in the draft project proposal. And I've given us the benefit of that by offering alternative words together with the evidence why this word more solidly describes our chosen direction. So I appreciate that it may not be intentional that you want to go back there, and maybe it's just a choice of words or old drafting that continues to prevail. And I want to link this to comments that we've had several board members say so far during these introductory remarks about the matters not being cast in stone. I guess I want to ask the rhetorical question. If it's not stone, what is it? If after 18 months of consensus building on it, after getting firm support from the PIOB and others, as Lynn has described to us, surely if it's not stone, it's going to be something pretty close to stone, so that the expectations we set don't land us up on the wrong continent and the wrong hemisphere, but that they continue to drive us in the general direction of where this is. If it drives us beyond it, like Josephine's described, I think I welcome that. But if there are going to be U-turns on these issues, then today I would definitely prefer stone to any other compound that is going to get us over there. So I guess the question then to ask is, because Tom put a very direct question to us about specificity in this, is what is the safeguard then against regression if we don't commit to some specificity here? During the life of this project, as we go through different iterations and flexibility, how will this thing get us to the direction that we think we're going to be voting on next week, Monday? Lynn, as you've put up these three questions, and I noted that you asked that we comment on all of them, and this is a substantial number of things that are covered in these three questions. And I don't want to mess this up because I think it's pretty important mood setting for where we are on this. I want to reflect quickly on the work that the task force that the working group has done since the last meeting, especially what you've described as the additional work. Now, there is a conclusion in the issues paper that says that you've done the work, my paraphrasing, nothing really new has come to light. So I've made the effort to read what you have supplied to us, and we were thrilled that we thought we'd identified 2 or maybe 3 new things out of it, including some great academic research that backed up 2 or 3 of these new things. And they don't stand alone. I appreciate that they also may have had references in the responses we had to discussion paper. I appreciate you said that they're not to be discussed, but that was on the presumption that there was nothing new. on the understanding that I think that there are new issues here, I want to raise them, please. If we look at the analysis, we identified these additional points in quick succession. The first one is about auditor independence and objectivity as a lesson learned. It's spelled out in a number of places in that additional work. And the question therefore to ask is, what's the working group's thinking about incorporation of that here? I appreciate at the moment, the working group has dismissed it. It said that there's nothing new came out of the process. And what enhancements can be made in that area? Secondly, relying on the work of others, and if and how this links to the auditor's responsibilities around fraud. It hasn't really been explored before or explored in the PP, but it came up in that additional research. And then the third one was the issue of responding to suspicion versus responding to confirmed fraud and distinguishing the nature and extent of the response between those two. So when an auditor encounters something suspicious versus when the encounters a confirmed fraud, recognizing suspicion is far more commonplace than a confirmed fraud, that there is a graduated response to those things. I think that was partially covered in the PP under what's described as paragraph FV. I'm not sure what paragraph number that was, but not fully addressed in the issues paper. And then finally, a comment about how the fraud risk assessments would be dealt with in the context of a group audit. I thought that was also something that came out of it new, and I really wouldn't like to see all of the work and outreach done in this area, at least a part of the work and outreach done in this area, overlooked or neglected, when in fact these were wonderful new things. At the same time, the working group has identified in paragraph 18D, non-material fraud and third-party fraud as issues that deserve further attention. My view before, and I thought that there was a position captured in previous minutes, that this is a significant distraction to the focus of this project. Based on the initial responses to DP, there was also no support on these. And this simply doesn't align with paragraph 2320 in the project proposal. And I'd encourage the working group to have another look at that. As we get to these things, I've commented already about the overall structure and how pleasing I thought it was. But then you reference the structure as you've described it in paragraph 23. I think that's great. But what I'd ask you to reflect on, please, is whether 23B aligns fully, and this is an example where the issues paper is talking to the project proposal, to section 3, paragraph 11 in 3A, and whether where there is non-alignment, whether that can be expanded, whether that can be aligned a little bit more closely. On the proposed objectives, which is B on your screen now, and is paragraph 11 and 12 in the actual project proposal, there are several things there that I think deserve attention. The first, Lynn, is this idea that clarifying the roles and responsibilities remains our objective. And I'm really principally opposed to the idea that that is our primary goal. The definition of clarify remains to make a situation less confused and to make it more comprehensible. My understanding, we could use PIOB words, we could use words from our minutes. We're really thinking about enhancing and strengthening the roles and responsibilities of auditors. If it was simply a case of clarification, this wouldn't be a high priority project the way we've given this attention. And I'd encourage the working group to look at that, please. The second one is the objective in 11B, which points to the development of some audit procedures. Len, it says that we would enhance and clarify ISO 240 to establish more robust audit procedures. Then you'd agree with me that actually ISO 240 doesn't establish audit procedures, it establishes requirements. And I thought we should be more explicit about establishing more robust requirements instead of audit procedures. The next one, and I just did this as a completeness check, believing that we actually need another 2 objectives. I provided the full text of this, but I'll paraphrase it for purposes of the board, that my suggestion is that project objective 11E needs to be about consequential amendments. There's no mention of consequential amendments between A to D. So I'm proposing an 11E that reads proposed consequential amendments to other standards that may be necessary as a result of the revisions of ISA 240 revised. I drew that language for the ISA 315 project proposal. And then I'm proposing yet another project objective as project objective F, which I've also drawn from the ISA 315 project, which is to determine what other non-authoritative guidance should be developed by the IAASB to supplement revisions to ISA 240 revised, thereby aiding its effective implementation. I hope those are not controversial. They just talk to what we actually plan to do. I don't think we plan not to do those two things, but I wanted to just reflect them as being reasonable additions in this area. That's my comments on this. If I've missed anything, I do apologize. I hope my written comments will help cover me in that area. Thank you.
Okay. There's a couple of more flags tense up, and we'll respond to a number of your points, Imran, after we get Wendy's and Edo's comments in. Wendy?
Thank you, Tom. Lynn and your group, your working group, we congratulate you on the extensive work performed and the process that was undertaken. Really impressed with the result, and we are supportive of the structure of the project proposal. I looked at it also in the context of informing future proposals, so did spend a lot of time going through the structure, and I did not have any real, background from the past in terms of project proposals. So I thought this was really well put together. I'm a big fan of tables and things side by side. So I liked Isabel's earlier recommendation on the side by side reconciliation. We did send in some specific comments. We are concerned that the words used are too specific in making it sound like we're already rewriting a standard as opposed to a project proposal to look to be writing those aspects. So those we did already send in. We agree with one. So we're good with the overall structure. We agree with the proposed project objectives are there, achieve the public interest, and we agree with 1C as well. And I'll color in some of the other detailed comments that we made. Again, they are framed in the context of considerations, and I trust the working group to consider them, and the outcome will be for the greater good. Thank you.
Thank you. Edo?
Thank you, Tom. Lynn, working group, I guess, yeah. Congratulations on the material presented. And thank you for inventing the wheel for us going forward. I've provided some offline comments, probably in a little bit more detail than I would otherwise have done at this stage, but given that you are inventing the wheel, I thought it was important that I give you the benefit of our thinking. If I look at the overall structure and content, I'm happy with the structure, but we did have some questions, and this touches upon what Imran has said, and also a little bit on the comments from Isabel, is that we have done a lot of work already. We have taken quite a number of issues and thoughts to the board where we've discussed them, and we've provided steer on where to go. And as a result, I was struggling a little bit with section 5 that presents a slew of issues that are then to a large extent repeated in section 6 as part of the project objectives. And I have, as a result, of sympathy for Imran's comment that I would have expected the work done and the considerations brought forward by the board to be reflected in 5 that drive the issues that will be addressed. So that's more of an outcome based with an appreciation of what has gone into it already, including elements of weighing the public interest, etc. So that I think is in respect of the structure my main comment, and I think we that's something for the working group to consider. So if I then move on to B, the proposed project objectives, that's well, and I link that to a large extent also back to paragraph 23, where, oh, and maybe, sorry, I'm just going one step back, apologies. I think that with the work being put in, the steer from the board, that you've captured what you're going to focus on in paragraph 23 fairly well. I don't see them as set in stone, but they are they're still rather directive into where we're going to. Well, that was the whole purpose of the exercise and spending all this time up front, that we now know clearly what we're going to focus on and what not. And I recognize some of the comments that Imran also made on what not. So if I then go to the project objectives to achieve the public interest, I'm going to echo a little bit of what Sashika also said, and that is that I am a firm proponent on a project on this, but there's only so much we can do. And I would like that emphasis a little bit stronger. We will do everything we can, but it is so much that we can do, and there's a larger ecosystem at place here. Where next to what we will do, I think there could also be a stronger emphasis on the other actions. Well, the IAASB has the ear of a number of other stakeholders where we can use our voice to promote that a little bit stronger. And that's then going into paragraphs 27, 29, I guess. So that would be my other suggestion. And in respect to the bullet C, I think that is, we didn't have any substantive comments with that. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And Joanna, I think you're coming in for Eric, who had to be in apologies today.
Thank you, Tom. And Eric regrets that he could not be in attendance today, but he had asked me to share the following comments. He wanted to congratulate the working group and the staff on the project proposal. He thought it was an excellent paper. He's supportive of the structure and the objectives, and he did not identify any serious concerns or fatal flaws with it. He did send in a few comments in advance to the working group, all of which related to proposed actions that he thought seemed specific for a project proposal stage. And he believes it may be premature to be so specific because the task force will need to consider the options as they get into doing the work of revising the standard. In the few items he's flagged, he provided suggestions where the language could be at a bit of a higher level. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me try to summarize a few of the points that I heard. In general, there was support for much of A, B, and C here. But that doesn't mean that everyone was fully supportive. There was one issue about the etched in stone nature of the issues. And I think our discussion was pretty clear up front, but we're seeing a few tensions here. My guess is that from the way I've interpreted it and the way I interpret the discussion is that it's relatively etched in stone, but as you know, as project deliberations continue, people may be informed by something else and it may evolve. But I think what I hear as an undertone in Imran's and Edo's remarks, amongst others, is that no desire to reduce the level of ambition and scope of the project more generally. And that when we say it's not etched in stone, what I don't want us to be held to account on is if they evolve or the list adapts slightly, that we failed the project at the end of the day because that 3 years down the line, someone says, well, use your project proposal said this, and you've done something slightly different, but that will be part of our due process. It will be driven by evidence. So that was one of the things that I said. And this is just sort of, I'm just framing this up, and I'm sure the task force has. So I heard ecosystem comment, and it's really funny on the ecosystem topic. The reason why it doesn't feature prominently, because at the front, there was a reliance on that concept of financial ecosystem. And we wanted to emphasize how much we would do as a board, because that's in our control. So maybe there's a balance to be found here. But, this was a push we got also from our Public Interest Oversight Board. One of the things we asked people at the front was, have we missed anything? And Imran raises the issue of, were there topics on the root cause analysis that haven't appeared in the paper? And so I think the task force could probably respond. I mean, the working group could respond to that, whether they may appear in some form or another, or we should consider it more broadly. Imran was the only one who I think raised a desire for new objectives in the public proposed project objectives. I think we could consider that, but they seem to be different. They seem to be actions, the types of ways you want. So maybe the task force could respond to that. And then there were issues of timeline. And some of this, actually, I saw it playing out, was how much has that 18-month period that we've gone through gotten us set up to deliberate with due speed and get a project out and decisions made. And we saw this tension amongst the board, amongst specificity, the desire for specificity. So it was sort of telling us where we're going to go. And then others on the board said, well, we haven't had our deliberations. We were just saying, setting up the project proposal. You may be too specific. And so we see a little bit of that playing out here. But I think the timeline is something that we could consider against the resources, the practicality, where we stand today. But I'm just trying to summarize, Lynn, for you, what I heard. You may have heard some other issues, but I just wanted to make sure that you had an opportunity to respond. A lot there, but I'll turn it over to you and the working group.
Thanks very much, Tom, and thank you all for those comments. Very helpful. The major thing I heard was support, and also that we've been responsive, and that was very important to the working group, that we did take seriously all of the inputs and responded to them. Yes, timeline we'll come to later in the session, agree there. That tension between specificity and flexibility is an absolute tension. And whilst we have given the best direction we can give at this point in time, we need to remain flexible for things that may change or better ideas that come up. So I accept that there is a tension between them, but I think there isn't any plan. You plan to do something and something changes around you and you might have to change. So this is the best direction based on everything that we've got at present. I think whether it's set in stone or flexible, I mean, everybody will have a slightly different opinion there, and we will take an approach that is the best balance between all the opinions that we can get. I accept the comments on the ecosystem, that people would like us to strengthen them. The working group will certainly look at what we can do in that regard. I think it's important to say on the public record that our focus has to be on our role of standard setting, and that whilst we put importance on the whole ecosystem, there's only so much we can do in that area. Not saying we're not going to do something, it's just it isn't our primary role. In terms of joining up 18 and 23, I am not sure practically whether we can do that at present, but I think it's an extremely good point for the future. Take that on board. In terms of Imran's comment about setting in stone that we might regress, I have absolute faith in the professionalism of the board and the task force to make sure that we keep that healthy tension and debate alive and that we keep heading in the right direction. In terms of your new issues, Imran, I can see that most of them are covered in various parts of the work we've done, for example, independence and working with IAASB, the suspicious mindset and a suspicion of fraud is part of us bringing together all of our responses when there's suspected or actual fraud. Group is something new that we haven't had before, and we'll certainly look at that. And non-material fraud and third party came up in the root cause. If the board doesn't want us to look at that, interested in any other comments, maybe offline or in the content section, but they were certainly big issues. I personally think the non-material fraud is a really important one because of the way that non-material frauds recognise weaknesses and controls and then lead to bigger frauds in the future that aren't, if they're not picked up. In terms of your two more objectives, we'll obviously reflect on that, as will the working group, but inclined to Tom's opinion that they are actions, are certainly things that we have got in the plan and think are important. Whether they are at the level of objectives is a open question for me. But generally, I'd just like to conclude by thanking everybody for that very useful input that we will, of course, take through to the task force meeting. But I'm happy for anyone else in the working group or any staff to add anything that I may have missed.
Anyone from the working group or staff want to add anything to Lynn? I see Imran's hand up. Imran?
Thank you. I had just missed one comment, and as it relates to structure, and it was the inclusion of the appendix within the project proposal. The appendix is 5 or 6 pages long, and it reads like, in some places, like the minutes of the work that we've done. I wonder whether there was any interest in shortening it substantially, or even deleting Appendix A, or summarizing it in some way, so that, Fernando's concern about a very long project proposal, we could save 4 or 5 pages here. And of course, much of this is now already behind us and captured in previous minutes, like outreach with particular firms and particular professional bodies that goes on for almost 3 pages in the appendix, maybe 4 pages. And if that isn't the case, then I provided a few edits on the appendix that may be relevant. Thank you.
Tom, if I can respond directly to that. Imran, we did have it in the body of the plan, a summary of it, and it was distracting, which is why we put it in the appendix. So the intention at this time would be to look at your edits and leave it as an appendix. Thanks.
To me, I don't know, I thought part of why it had some value was to put on public record the intensive exercise we went through to get to this point. Of course, that should facilitate the rapid deliberation of some of the issues, but I thought it was just useful as we have gone through the information gathering and research phase for the first time, really, to have it on the public record as an appendix, and I didn't see any harm in that. But does anyone else at the board table feel any differently than me on this? Okay, so the suggestion is to look through Imran's edits and see if we could see if they help the clarity of the document. Josephine, you had your tent up for a second. Do you mean to take it down?
I was only going to respond to Imran's comments. I agree with you, Tom, and certainly I respect there may be some edits, but I wouldn't like to see this removed from the project proposal.
Okay. Any other comments, Lynn, on this topic? Maybe if we're done with question one, which had a lot of substantive, high-level issues to address, would it be useful to take a short break, Lynn?
Yes, it would be, thanks.
Okay, what I'm going to suggest is an 8-minute break that we're going to get back at 4:45 our time, Eastern time. So quarter to the hour, we'll reconvene. Thank you. 2-minute warning. Please come back to your seats. Sally Ann, could you ask people to start, if they're still in the corridor, come back in? All right, can we all take our seats? Okay, I think we should start gathering back. Okay, Lynn, are you ready to go?
I am.
Okay, the floor is yours.
Next slide, please. Okay, on the slide in front of you are all the key interests, all the key issues to be addressed by the project. I just wanted to talk through not those issues, but what they mean. These were developed from the issues and challenges raised by stakeholders in the information gathering and research process, and we took all of the issues and all of the challenge and we've grouped them by theme. So these are not challenges and issues that the working group have made up. They are as a result of the analysis of all of the input that we received. They also include the input we got from the board and Keg during 2020 and 2021. And just to refresh your minds about where the sources of these issues and themes are, firstly, the discussion paper, secondly, the responses to that discussion paper, thirdly, the round tables, fourthly, the academic research, fifthly, the further work on root cause, and finally, the developments in other jurisdictions that we took into account. Next slide, please. Just before I move on to the question, all of the we have mapped all of the issues we have considered at the last 3 board meetings, and they are all included in those key themes, the key issues, and so we think it has got we know it has got everything that the board has discussed to date. This question 2 asks for whether there's anything else from the information gathering that you think we haven't put in, any other insights from the root cause, and whether it appropriately covers the key issues. I'm very aware many people have already taken the opportunity to comment on this. So if we, Tom, can make the answer, take the answers that are on top of what they've already said, rather than repeat what's already been discussed. We've got that recorded and we'll consider it. So with that, Tom, can we take all parts of this together and get any further comments from the board?
So we're looking for incremental comments as it relates to question 2. The comments you have been noted on question 1 are taken and will be addressed at the working group level, or if they have been discussed. So anyone want to come in here? Josephine.
Thank you, Lynn. And I think one of the comments that was made was just to make sure that they're consistent between the main table where they're repeated and yeah, Bev's nodding at me, so I've got that. Just a couple of comments I want to raise. In 18A2, the auditor's responsibilities and fraud in an audit financial statements has been questioned, as well as whether the definition of fraud remains appropriate. I think from my perspective, this does imply that the auditor's responsibilities are potentially too much, and whether the auditor should be responsible. So I just think that what would be better here is if we actually use the words that we've seen before, which is around the auditor's responsibilities on fraud need to be enhanced or clarified. I do understand that there are lots of conversations about, in all our roundtables as well, about the fact that the auditor's responsibilities might be misunderstood, but question does imply that there should be less responsibility when I read that. So if we could have a look at that, that would be helpful. I'm just making sure I'm only picking up the things that weren't already mentioned. In terms of technology, which is D1, I think actually when we did have the roundtable, the technology one, it was about 2 aspects of it. One, using technology to conceal or fraudulent activity, for example. And then, of course, the auditor's use of technology to identify fraud risks. So if we could just perhaps expand on that. I think the linkages to ISO 550 in respect of E2 needs to be brought out as well. And again, that's just, I think the other points I have, Lynn, are just in terms of consistency. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Josephine. Yosh, good morning. Good, very early morning to you in Tokyo.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Tom. Good early morning in Japan. This is my first time talk, so I want to express my sincere appreciation to Lynn and the working group members for their hard work in preparing this project proposal. I have 2 comments about the matter 2, and I would like to confirm the following about the paragraph 18, small f1. Indications and situations of fraud are case by case for each entity, so auditors' responses and procedures should be different. Therefore, when revising this standard, it is necessary to be careful not to make a checklist by being too focused on clarification, and the principle-based approach should be maintained, like that paragraph 18F. And matter 2, small c, I have 1 comment, additional key issues I want to consider to the working groups. In the early period after the change of auditor, the successor auditor tends to lack understanding of the client, which leads to insufficient risk assessment and a high possibility of audit failure. Therefore, from the viewpoint of complementing such shortage, I would like the working group to consider adding the emphasis on the requirements for succession of audit engagement to the key issues in this project proposal. For example, the fraud risk response standard in Japan required that in taking over the audit engagement, the status of addressing the fraud risk and fraud or suspected fraud by management or employees who play an important role in internal control shall be appropriately communicated from the predecessor to the successor auditor. Thank you, that's it.
Thank you, Yash. Next, Wendy.
Thank you, Tom. On part 5, we had just some linkage comments. So for example, proposed action 6 recommends non-authoritative guidance for KPIs and is linked to 18B, but we don't see the discussion of the KPIs in 18B. Proposed action 8 recommends enhancing recommendations or application material related to written representations, and it's linked to 18C, and we couldn't find that there either. So these are really just cosmetic linkages, I think. And then proposed action 9 recommends enhancing application material for ISO 240 to reflect and describe fraud risks presented by use of technology to perform fraud-related procedures, and is linked to 18D, but 18D only speaks to the auditor, and therefore it's unclear which issue the first part of the proposal is addressing. We recommend 18D include support for or clarify the proposed action in number 9. Thank you.
Thank you. Chun-Wei?
Thank you, Tom. Lynn, just 2 points to raise here. I think the first one is the same one that Josephine raised about technology. So technology, we know, and in your introductory comments, you made the same point as well. So one is the auditor's use of technology, which is already reflected in D. The other one is how technology enables or otherwise impact on the way fraud gets committed. And I thought maybe it will be appropriate to reflect that in B small 1. The next point is on B small 2, about engagement team discussion. I think what is mentioned here is whether it's robust enough for consideration of fraud throughout the audit. I don't disagree with that. I think it's not, but it's not just about robustness of the discussion, but how that almost heightened professional skepticism, that mindfulness about fraud actually permeates the audit. Because I think typically after the discussion, the team get that enhanced view about fraud, but that may not be sustained throughout. So I wonder whether that can be reflected as well, and also in the subsequent solution. Thanks.
Thank you, Chun-Wei. Imran.
Thank you very much. Lynn, I'm not able to provide all of repeat all of the written comments that I provided you here, but I'm going to use a couple of illustrations to make the point, and I think the point will repeat itself throughout paragraph 18. The first is your question around the completeness of this information, because you've asked that in 2A. And I'm going to reflect again here on the earlier comment I made on 3C, and the 3 areas that I thought 3C identified that aren't picked up yet in the key issues in paragraph 18. The second thing that I'd like to raise, and this is a transversal issue across paragraph 18, is the way that the choice of language in how individual issues are put forward results in us being able to classify an issue either as a statement or as a question. So when we start something, for example, B1, it says questions have been raised. Yet elsewhere, we say, as in D1, it says it has been highlighted that ISO 240 needs to be modernized. The way I read the difference between those two comments is that B1 is inconclusive. We're going to go and ask questions about it again. whereas D1, which says it has been highlighted, is conclusive. ISA 240 needs to be not modernized for whatever, ... And you'll find that this is inconsistent for a number of reasons. In the first instance, there are several items described in section 5 which are posed as questions here. But later on, in the proposed direction, in the scope of work, they are not questions. We have decided the direction. We've actually said that this is what will be done. It will be enhanced. And so in a few places, I have offered the potential to rewrite it. And let me give you an example. In G1, for example, where it says there are views, my suggestion would be that that should be rewritten as it has been highlighted. And similarly, I've offered 3 or 4 places where for the task force to reflect on how that could be reframed. So I make the point that it's not internally consistent between paragraph 18 and paragraph 23, but also there are several points in paragraph 18 where in fact the minutes or the results of the DP or other things already indicate that the position is established. And so I would imagine that 18 really should be a series of statements. Therefore, 23 would make sense because 23 has responses to the statements made in 18. I hope that's clear enough, but if it isn't, then there's comprehensive notes that I provided on it. Then I was unsure really around A1, where whether the planned action in relation to 18A1 is appropriate. And I provided a suggestion about what a more appropriate response could be there. In 18A2, where we say auditors' responsibilities and fraud in an audit financial statements have been questioned, I think you would agree with me, Lynn, that if it's been questioned, then this goes beyond the question of merely clarity. Without recoding that definition of clarity, we've translated this has been questioned in the actions to be merely clarification. And I don't think what people are asking for is clarify it. They're asking, as the PIOB has, and as you have elsewhere, talk about a strengthening of those requirements. So that's the general sense of comments I have here. I'll use another example, and this is in relation to B2. B2 says questions have been raised whether the engagement team discussion is robust enough. In paragraph 23 below, we don't raise that as a question. We go as bold enough as to say they have to be enhanced. You've already made the decision that it is to be enhanced. And so therefore we could rewrite B2 as it has been highlighted that the engagement team discussion is not robust enough, as opposed to posing it as a question. I have one other comment of a different nature here, and that is this comment about non-authoritative guidance. I'll raise it here for the first time, but there's probably more to be said as we progress to paragraph 23. And that is that we make the point, as we've discovered through our outreach, that there's a need to link the standards more clearly, that ISA 240 needs better signposts to matters that are lying elsewhere. Yet the response to it that is currently being proposed is some non-authoritative guidance outside of the standard that will provide some signposting. And actually, it's the action in 2312. And I want to make the point that if at the moment the standard on its own is not making the clear linkages, I find it hard to understand how a standalone non-authoritative document is going to make linkages clearer to people who are reading the standard. So really reflect whether that's an appropriate response to what you've heard so many people say in relation to the linkages that are in the standard. Then that's what I chose to raise in the plenary at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. Imran, on a couple of those points you raised actually in planning committee last week. Of course, we haven't redrafted this yet, but I know the working group is actually working on moving towards statement in paragraph 18. So I'm sure that'll come back. I see any other, Lynn.
Tom, could I just come back there? I was remiss in not saying up front that the comments that are made about consistency and statement or questions in paragraph 18, we are working on those to make them more consistent going forward. So can I just put that on the table so people are aware that we are actively working on that right now. In fact, the staff are half listening to this and half working on paragraph 18. So we hope to have it more consistent going forward.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Okay, Lynn, I think it's back to you anyway in terms of responding to other comments.
Okay.
Wait, hold 1 second, Lynn. Janine, you raised your hand.
Yes, thanks, Tom, and hello to everyone. I have a question, if I may, based on the question on the slide, whether there are some things coming from the root cause work undertaken. My question is whether it is the intention of the task force to also include the internal control, thoroughly understanding of internal controls, including the design and operating effectiveness of the controls and how management is involved. This is something that was highlighted in paper 3C, resulting from the root cause analysis. Whether that is something that you will take also together with the use of technology. I was thinking, where is this important issue somewhere in the focus areas included? And I thought, well, the best thing is to ask the question, how that will be taken on board, because there is, with the internal controls, in my view, a very important link with the fraud risk. And also more broadly, if you look at the audit approach in audit firms, currently there is a trend towards more substantive testing and less testing of internal controls to rely on those, actually. So this could be a very relevant topic when the task force is exploring and thinking about strengthening ISA 240 and other related ISAs. To strengthen the role of the auditor in towards fraud.
Okay, Bev?
Thanks. So we have quite comprehensive changes that will come through from ISA 315 and the robustness of ISA 315. And that really wraps up a lot of the internal control. So there may not be as much specificity in the project proposal, but all of those good changes that were made in ISA 315, I think, cover off on some of the internal control points that you've raised. And that's why there was nothing additional from the root cause, because we knew we had already covered it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Lynn, back to you.
Thank you. On auditor responsibility, we are refining the words on that, so we'll get back to you on that. The point's been made several times that we haven't covered both bits of technology, so we'll look at that. We are looking at the linkages between 18 and 23 to make sure they're all accurate, and thank you for the input there. On the engagement team discussion, we will consider how and if we put in that it needs to be sustained throughout. And I've already talked about the consistency of language in paragraph 18. In terms of the non-authoritative guidance, Imran, I think implicitly we know that we have to, if there's a linkage to another standard, we have to make it within 240 revised. We also thought it would be useful to be able to show pictorially how 240 fits with the other slides. So I think this is a both and, not an or. And I think that covers the, Yosh, we certainly will take on board your comments around the principle-based and 2C. Thank you. That, I think, completes that section, Tom.
I think so. Back to you.
Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so taking those three objectives and talking about how we're going to address them, it's in three ways: standard setting, non-authoritative guidance, and the other actions. We got a very strong message from the board over the last three meetings that they wanted more emphasis on standard setting and less emphasis on non-authoritative guidance. That wasn't to say there should be no non-authoritative guidance, but that the emphasis should be on standard setting. So what we have done is, on those three circles, we've put the emphasis on standard setting. We still have some non-authoritative guidance, as well as the other actions, which are largely around education and the wider ecosystem. The proposal is that, just to give you a sense of the change that we've made since we put this to the board over the last three meetings in non-authoritative guidance, approximately 50% of it we have moved into standard setting. For example, the definition of fraud, we've moved to being addressed in application material. The same with unpredictability procedures, and certainly on transparency, looking at recommendations and application material. So we have very seriously listened to what you said to us and tried very hard to move that to application material and requirements where we thought that was warranted. Next slide, please. Reflecting back on what we heard in the meetings, there was a lot of agreement. Usually in meetings, we concentrate on the things we don't agree on, and that's perfectly sensible. But I just want to reflect for a second on the things that we did agree on during that process, and that therefore we have moved forward. One was a definition of fraud and clarifying bribery and corruption in that regard. The second one, and this is a very, very big part of this revision, and that is updating it for the risk identification and assessment in line with 315. And that includes all the internal control, culture, tone at the top, which are absolutely vital in the context of fraud. So that is a very big area of this revision. There's agreement that we should consider technology. The linkage between 240 and 250 and between the ISAs, taking into account Imran's current comments. Also agreement on audit documentation, external confirmations, largely on that skepticism is important and also that transparency is important. Next slide, please. But there are some areas where we have emphasised that they need to be strengthened, clarified or enhanced. And if you can just take that, we will get those words all more consistent in the next draft. The 6 areas where we have made changes are the auditor's responsibility. one of the things we're trying to do in terms of auditor responsibility, and something that isn't easy, is to get more consistent behaviour of auditors across the across globally. And we had in doing that, a strong call from board members in CAG that reordering the paragraphs was not enough. So we have proposed that we need to re-articulate the responsibilities and strengthen them. In terms of specialised skills, we've taken on board the comments that we heard that the proposed action should be broader, that it should look at all specialised skills rather than only forensic skills, and strengthen, and we have therefore strengthened the action to include consideration of a new requirement there. The responses to material misstatement, we have more specificity in the proposed actions there to include a standback as was requested, and also to make sure we put an emphasis on management bias. On the written recommendations for management, we've added more specificity to the proposed actions. And on revenue recognition, we have proposed actions to revise the requirement to include a more risk-based approach. And finally, on this slide, on analytical procedures, we have been more specific, we have provided more clarity around the proposed actions. Next slide, please. On journal entries and unpredictability procedures, we, originally they were going to be non-authoritative guidance, but we've deliberated and we think that they should be, as I have previously said, within application material. In terms of the procedures when a fraud is detected, we are going to develop a new requirement. We're going to bring everything together and consider elevating existing application material to a requirement. We've already noted non-material fraud and third-party fraud, which were brought back in as a result of the root cause analysis. If anyone, we've heard Imran's comments on that. I'd be interested in any other comments. And finally, on transparency, we have put in more in terms of those charged with governance, but this is the one area where we think we need to explore more in terms of reporting. We went back and did a thorough analysis of the responses and all of the research, and there are nested and embedded different opinions in terms of the auditor reporting. For that reason, we have decided we probably need to do a bit more outreach and bring this back as a specific topic to the March meeting. I know there are different views on that, but that's where we have landed. Next slide, please. Okay, as we started this meeting, we talked about the PIF and the elements of the PIF. These are the characteristics that they have that should be addressed in every project. We considered very carefully where we should put these in the project proposal and decided it related best to the actions we proposed, and that for each of those actions we should consider the following characteristics. Is it scalable? Is it relevant? Is it comprehensive? Is it clear and concise? Can it be implemented? And is it enforceable? So these have been put here, and when we get to the questions, we've got a specific question on not whether you agree or not with these characteristics. They are what they are, but have we got them in the right place? And any advice on how we embed them and how we actually take the project forward. So moving on to the next question. You're asked here to look at the proposed actions, whether they're sufficient to deal with the issue. Once again, we've already got some input on this, so this is an incremental question. And we will take B as a separate consideration at the end once we've been through them. Next slide, please. Because we thought it would be good to have several rounds here of things. So if we take, and I'm going to suggest we take all everything on each slide as the issues to discuss. So we have groups 1 and 2 first, then we have 2 more rounds in terms of covering them, or we might just do 1 more round depending on how we go. But can we start by looking, Tom, at the actions proposed on auditors' roles and responsibilities, fraud, specialised skills, risk, KPIs, rebuttable presumptions, and responses to risk of material misstatement. And once again, it's incremental. Thanks, Tom. Back to you.
Okay. So this is on top of comments we've already heard. Does everyone have see the issues that are being for your consideration right now? Okay. Any comments? Sachiko.
Thank you, Tom. My comment is about rebuttable presumption of fraud risk in revenue recognition. It seems that the current description in the project proposal only addresses determination about whether or not rebuttable presumption is applicable. But I think it is also important to clarify what action is needed once the auditor determines that presumption fraud risk in revenue recognition is applicable, because I think this clarification also helps to address the issue of inappropriate rebuttal, because I heard some auditor rebut the presumption because they cannot design substantive procedures that are specifically responsive to that risk in accordance with 330, as there is no indication of possible fraud risk. So I think this clarification about further audit procedure on revenue recognition is also helpful to address the issue of rebuttal, and maybe we can include this point in the project proposal as well. And by the way, I strongly support the addition of the matter relating to risk identification and assessment on this point as well. So thank you very much for doing that. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Sachiko. Isabel?
Yes, thank you. So again, I'm trying to tie in paper 3A with group 1 and group 2 we have on the slide. Not very sure I'm at the right place, but at least I will try to comment on the use of specialized skills, which I believe is 18A3. 18A3, yeah. And when I read what we are proposing in 3A, I believe we lack part of the discussions we already had at the board on 2 elements. One is the use of the word forensic skills. So we propose to describe forensic skills, to describe what it means. So I'm not sure someone that is not in the boardroom will understand why we face this issue and why we feel the need maybe to use another word. I was really interested, Lynn, when in the introduction you mentioned not a forensic specialist, but a fraud specialist. So maybe it could be something interesting to use if the word forensic is raising issues, but I'm not sure the reader of the paper will understand why the word forensic is raising issues, and we already have some material to comment around that. The other point I wanted to make on this one, sorry, it's here. Yes, it's on the scalability part also in 18A3, because we say we want to add scalability, and of course I concur with that, but maybe we should also put more meat around what we mean by scalability. It could be the nature of the entity, it could be the significance of the fraud risk, it can be the nature of the fraud. Some fraud may be not complex, they may not require forensic fraud skills. So maybe we should provide more meat on what we mean by scalability, because it's not the size of the entity, it's a combination of a lot of elements. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Josephine.
Thank you, and thank you to the working group for putting more emphasis on standard setting in a lot of the areas that were mentioned. Really appreciate that. Just a couple of points. You probably already heard this before, but in terms of 18A, enhancing and clarifying the introductory paragraphs, I'm slightly worried about the first bullet in particular, because it talks about emphasizing the auditor's responsibilities by placing them prior. I know it's a collection of different things that you're looking at, but I do believe that when we talked about this as a board, this just felt like moving things around. And I don't think moving things around, words around, is necessarily going to get to changing behaviors. So potentially what we could do, and I have sent comments along, is remove those 2 bullet points and think about just considering changes and enhancements made to reduce the ambiguity between the inherent limitations of an audit and the auditor's responsibility, because you have the leading that talks about enhance and clarify. I'm just going to go down, bear with me. In respect of 18B, questions around robustness, and then the 1, 2, 3rd bullet point there. I'm not sure, I suppose it's a similar point to Isabel's really. I'm not sure that strengthening the link between 240 and A and C process is going to necessarily jump out as what that actually means. So the link between ISO 240 and the acceptance and continuance process, in the July meeting, I think the wording that the information is obtained during that process that's relevant to the auditor's understanding was actually clearer. So maybe we just need to just build on that little bullet point a bit more, please. Bear with me, I'm just trying to make sure I don't go too far. And then, sorry about this. I think then, Lynn, I think the other points I made were really just, oh yes, I think technology, is that included? So yeah, I need to, that's so 18D. I wondered whether we might want to think about building some of those aspects of the changes in ISO 220 on bias. So for example, automation bias into this area as well. It might be too detailed, but of course you still want to go back as a working group and look at the balance, but just something to think about for that one. And then on 18E, number 12, the wording here tripped people up a bit, because it talks about, this is in non-authoritative guidance, but it talks about developing non-authoritative guidance that guides auditors in navigating the required actions Of course, required actions in our world mean requirements. So just need to maybe have another look at the wording there so it doesn't imply we're putting requirements in non-authoritative guidance, because that's obviously not what we mean. And then in 18F, requirements and application material in respect of journal entry testing. The first bullet implies that the understanding of controls over journal entries in ISO 315 only applies to considerations due to fraud. So can we just change the wording here? And I actually did send along some suggested wording to clarify that a little bit. And on the, just a minor point, but on the third bullet there, that wording, consider requiring the testing of journals, it's almost like the requirement as it is in the standard today. So perhaps just something like examine whether the testing of journal entries throughout the period should be required in all cases, something around there, just so people don't get tripped up on the fact that isn't that already a requirement. And then on the rebuttable presumption, I understand that we decided that enhancements to that rebuttable presumption would not occur. And I understand that you want to talk about a more risk assessment process, but could we even consider a requirement for the auditor to consider other areas that may be particularly susceptible to material misstatement due to fraud? So something a bit bolder in that area. And I do believe that's it for that section. Sorry to bring up so many. Thank you, Lynn.
Yosh.
Thank you, Chair Tom. I have just one comment about the responses to the assessed risk of material misstatement. Page 11, 18, LCE, what is, sorry, 18B, small b, number 4, the last paragraph, the last bullet. It is stated that as key issue for enhancing the requirements and the application material for fraud risk identification and assessment, the working group will consider providing examples related to the less complex entities to illustrate the scalability of the requirements. However, the development ISO for LCE is still in progress. In addition, I am concerned that if examples related to audit of LCEs are included in ISO 240 revised, it would be inconsistent with the understanding that the LCE ISO is an independent standard, and such that is misleading, I think. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Yosh. Chunwei.
Sorry, Tom, my laptop went to sleep. I need to wake it up. Can I come later?
Yes. Okay, Imran.
Thank you. I apologize in advance if I'm not able to map my comments to the way the groups are structured on the screen, and there may be some overlap or backwards and forwards around it. I think they're not in the same order as paragraph 23. My first comment is that there was a comment that Sachiko made, and I supported what she described. The next one is on 23A around the clarity of the role. I thought that I would just repeat the point earlier that it's not about clarity alone, and it's about the strengthening of these responsibilities. I think the second point to make is that there is a range of topics included under A or 18A, whichever referencing you're using. And then it seems like we're combining issues that really may not belong together, and they could be split out. And I've provided some comment about how they could be split. In relation to 18A1, and the responses about emphasizing auditors' responsibilities by placing them prior to the description of inherent limitations of an audit. We've heard Josephine speak about that again, or speak about that already. My view is that other than that is merely reordering of the words, and we have minutes of a previous meeting around that issue. This response is still incomplete. To me, the issue is about transparency of the auditor's responsibility, and this action as envisaged won't address the transparency of auditors' responsibilities. The third bullet there under 18A1, is about inherent limitations. And the issue then again is whether those inherent limitations are appropriate. This is what we understand the monitoring group was challenging in their response letters to us. And I've provided a more detailed comment on earlier on paragraph 18 about it. On the definition of fraud, which is within your group 1 topics here, I want to really just offer this as a reference to what to do to some discussion the board has had before, asking why is this response at the moment limited to application material. In the June board meeting minutes on this topic, and I quote, there was a suggestion that the definition be reconsidered to include bribery and corruption, further clarified by the statement that as long as it was clear how the concept of intellectual fraud, it may not be necessary to change the definition. From the above, there seem to have been different views still amongst the board members. Consequently, shouldn't our response not be broader to provide both possible outcomes there? Maybe I'll just go forward to 1 or 2 pages more. Hopefully in that way, I've covered off your groups 1 and 2. The next one that I want to then refer to would be 18B5, and this is a comment, the 3rd bullet there, about enhancing the application material in ISO 240 for when it may be beneficial for specialists to be used. I think we've heard from a number of stakeholders, most especially in today's letter from the SMPC community, that the when is probably not enough. It's also the how that people have asked us to reflect on. And I wanted to put that on the table. The nature and timing and extent of their involvement is as important as when it should be addressed. And that was an important scalability consideration that came in from a number of parties. And then in that same section under paragraph 6 around key performance indicators, Lynn, I don't know, or maybe perhaps you can remind me why the non-authoritative guidance, why the NAG approach was considered an appropriate response here. Was this specifically agreed or approved by the board before? Because we couldn't see couldn't easily find a record of a discussion around this. I thought that given the importance of enhanced and the more robust risk assessment procedures, shouldn't this be addressed at least in application materials and requirements to the extent possible before we turn to NAG? Before we turn to non-authoritative guidance. I'll stop at that point so that I can split it up across the various groups you have. So I've stopped at page 13 or under 18B so far. Thank you.
Chavli, are you ready?
Yeah, I've woken the laptop up. Thanks for coming back to me. So thanks, Tom, and thanks, Lynn. So on this part, we have sent, again, offline comments with expression of support throughout most of the sections, including through, I think, the work that my TA, Anthony's did with CNZ, CPA Canada, on the audit expectation gap. So through the research, we heard things that supported what we have here as well, and we have expressed that in the paper. So I'll just pick a few things to refer to here. The first one I want to mention is on 18B, and it's number 4, the first bullet point. I think the reference to requiring corroborative evidence, sort of, I took a pause there, and just wondering if we could be clear here about making sure we avoid anchoring bias as well, and it's not just about seeking corroborative evidence. The next point I want to raise is, I think Yosh mentioned the point, this is the last bullet for 18B4, and on the LCE, I have a, I guess, slightly different view. I'm actually quite supportive through, as we all know, all of us are very active engaging in LCE ED outreach now. One of the feedback I've heard is that the fact we've used ISA as the starting point to develop our proposed standard means that we might have missed out building more LCE specific materials, including, for example, requirements guidance on fraud that are very specific to the nature and circumstances of an LCE. So I do think that there is opportunity for close coordination between the fraud working group / task force with the LC task force as the LC project progress here. Next point I want to make is in relation to the rebuttal of fraud risk. So that's 18F, 15. Second solid bullet point, second empty bullet point, I don't know how to call it. But there's a point about clarifying when it's inappropriate to rebut. The presumption, I thought it's an interesting idea, but just listening to it being said out, clarify when it's inappropriate to rebut. The presumption, it sounds a little bit like, we are making rebuttal of presumption a norm. So I would say proceed with caution here. And just the last point I want to make here, describe public sector considerations. I would like us to consider LC considerations as well. For example, presumably many owner-managed smaller businesses would be more focused on reducing tax liabilities and therefore incentivized to report their revenue. So it's a slightly different direction, different focus. And I wonder if that could be built into our standard. Thanks, Lynn.
Josephine, you raise your card again.
I just wanted to ask a question, Chanwi, if I may, Chanwi, because you just made a point there about rebuttable presumption. Is it that you that reading it, you feel that the rebuttable presumption is going to be removed from the standard? No, okay.
No. I thought we are making it a norm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So I agree with what you said and what I think Sachiko said about focusing on addressing the risk. Thanks.
Thank you.
Lynn?
Thanks, Tom. Many of those comments we've received in writing. So in the interests of timeliness, I'm not actually going to go through them. We will consider them. What I'd like to suggest, Tom, now is another round, which is any other comments, rather than going through bit by bit, because I think it's going to take us too long, and we have many of the comments already in writing. So if we can go back a slide, please, Michelle. And if we take this question 3A of anything else you want to say about the proposed actions. So that's professional skepticism, transparency, written recommendations, and so forth, continuing on. We can put those slides up if you like, but I think it's very clear in the papers what they are. So yeah, any other comments that you have on the actions on all the other areas? Is that all right, Tom?
Yeah, so this is the remainder of paragraph 23 with a chart, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Any other incremental comments? Imran?
Yes, thank you. Lynn, this is about 10 pages still of the issues paper, so bear with me as we work through that. So I'm starting on page 13 of the issues paper, or 18C of the paragraph that is currently looked at. And this is this proposal in paragraph 7 about considering a stand-back requirement. I make the point that this is one of the few places where we have considering here. Why is this consider? It seems to be not consistent with the rest of paragraph 3. And I'm wondering whether it's appropriate to leave this open-ended in a project proposal. What are we really asking the task force to do here? And what more are we to learn through the task force that we don't already know from our 2 years of outreach around the need and relevance for this stand-back requirement? Followed quickly, my mistake in now bullet 8 or requirement 8, where there's consider again around enhancing written representations. Under number 9, application material and technology, I was wondering why only application material and why not the possibility of requirements. I don't know if this is the exact point that Janine made earlier. I thought generally that as it relates to modernization, the direction that we've had over our previous meetings was clear, that we were looking at technology in relation to its impact on fraud risk assessments and its impact on fraud responses, specifically journal entry testing, and that as currently described, it is rather vague. In relation to 10, this is a very unusual proposal we're making. We're making a proposal here to work collaboratively with the technology consultation group, and I think we made this proposal in more than one place. I have a due process concern about this. I think that this is within the remit of the board to make this determination. And that determination is the relevant time to make it is now. I think that it's not appropriate within a PP to ask this question and then leave the decision making to others to make, who are not within the direct control of the board. We may be setting our target too high here if we think that detailed tracking of this through the technology consultation group is necessary, instead of just a principal position around technology in the standard, which may make it much easier for us to close it off ourselves. The relationship between number 11, the relationship between ISO 240 and ISO 250, I thought that this is actually not a fraud response issue. This is a scoping issue, understanding which standard applies, whether ISO 240 applies, whether ISO 250 applies, or both. Is this not more accurately linked to the issue of the definition of fraud, that is understanding what constitutes fraud? Moving on to the next one, and this relates to paragraph 13. And this is the next reference we have here about non-authoritative guidance. I saw within the issues paper a very strong stand that we were making to reduce the dependence on non-authoritative guidance, and to be responsive to what the board said around having more standard setting work done, requirements and application material. And this is an example where, on the basis of linkages, I don't think that the NAG can fix the issue. The statistics that supports us here, Lynn, is that 48 respondents to the DP made mention of inappropriate linkages between ISO 240 and other ISOs. And specifically, 41 mentioned linkages to ISO 315. So linkages to 339 people asked for it, linkages to 548 asked for it, etc., etc. And I think that linkages should be embedded in the standard along the lines that we've described in order for them to be more useful. Under paragraph 15, I see, I found the rebuttable presumption now. This is, in our view, in the wrong place in the project proposal. I think it relates to risk assessment rather than the question of response. So it should be 18C and not sitting here in 15. But really happy with the enhancements that you are offering over here. So only a question of geography, no comment about the proposed actions. I think the proposed actions are all very good. Moving on to 24, appreciate we're getting close to the end. This is an example where we again refer to non-authoritative guidance, which then left us with the choice to count the promises we have made for non-authoritative guidance. So there are now 9 promises of non-authoritative guidance in issues paper, Lynn. And I thought that the board had concluded some of these issues should be scoped out before, but now they're resurfacing in another form that is as non-authoritative guidance. And this comes back to my earlier comment about being firm about our direction on some of these non-authoritative things, which are less relevant, low response rate, low interest. Tom has warned us cautioned us in an email to the board about our dependence on non-authoritative guidance and the ability to produce it. The capacity to do so, the capacity to process it. And I think that promising 9 pieces of non-authoritative guidance here is really a really big ask, alongside all of the other things that we have to work on. It may also be relevant when we think about the 18 months that we're giving ourselves for this project, that if the NAG is coming after the 18 months, then that would be really bad. But if we were able to reduce the number of NAG items, perhaps it would give us the the shortening of the time that we're looking for the life of this project. There is in paragraph 25, again, another dependency on the technology consultation working group. My earlier comment refers here, although I think that 25 is something that is not a material issue and should be out of scope. I know you've expressed a view different to that already, Lynn. I appreciate that. It'll probably still stay. And under 27 is my really one big worry about non-authoritative guidance. This is a crucial issue around a more robust response to risk. The ramp up that drives audit effort can't possibly reside within non-authoritative guidance. Isn't this precisely what the stakeholders are asking us to do? So if we are going to ramp up procedures when a fraud is identified or suspected, in my view, that is a very appropriate response to reside within the standard. How is a NAG going to drive the additional effort when it is at the heart of the expectation around the revision of the standard? The count here, at least per our count, at least 31 respondents raised this matter as a necessity. And I think that our response in this area should mirror the significance of the issue. On section D or 18H around enhanced transparency, just to repeat what we've said on earlier meetings, we concluded from our reading of the discussion paper that this was a priority issue. 39 respondents supported enhanced transparency and 23 had mixed views. We'll just leave that there to see how that reconciles with what direction we're proposing in this issues paper. There is really towards the end of the table in the second last big bullet, the use of the word explore for the first time, together with a footnote about how the word explore is defined here. My reading, therefore, of that footnote is that it implies that in every other case within paragraph 18, there will be no exploration first, because explore is only explained in one place, but rather standard setting will commence. In which case, the list in paragraph 18, we still suggest some explore and question really needs to be reconsidered so that it's replaced with some firm actions, because we're not considering exploration in the way exploration is explained here. Lastly, about the very, very last paragraph about suggesting that we undertake additional outreach with investor groups. My thought is that we continue to know this from the DP. We also know where firms stand in relation to this. We know where investor groups and users stand in relation to this. And we know that those groups sit on opposite ends of the spectrum here. Some who prefer no change to the disclosures, and some very prominent monitoring group members and others who envisage some change to those disclosures. With this kind of proposal, where we say we're just going to undertake additional outreach, we could really end up here with no standard setting in this area, despite the strong interest in this area. And this is an area in which I think that directionally, after 18 months of discussion, we need to be clearer and more helpful to the task group about the objective we have been asked to achieve. Again, the discussion paper's research on this point is that 39 respondents supported enhanced transparency here in general, and 23 had mixed views. But I've provided you with further statistics in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Imran. Next is Josephine.
Thank you. So I'll probably start on the point then that Imran just raised. It's probably not surprising that despite the explanation, Lynn, which I do appreciate, I was disappointed to see explore creeping in what I think is probably one of the most important aspects of enhancing transparency of the auditor's work and therefore hopefully reducing that expectation gap. But I would say that if the task force is still keen to keep explore, not be more committal with this language, you might, I did want to mention that the task force might be interested in the results of an ongoing FRC project on the impact of changes we made in auditor reporting in respect to fraud. Project should be completed around February 2022. So as you do your analysis, certainly something to have a look at. And the only other point in this section is just slightly further up. The remediation measures taken by management and those charged with governance, it comes across that this is just going to be a discussion Whereas in fact, really, I think what we were thinking about in July is that the auditor really needs to assess those remediation measures in order to then properly have communication as to whether they're appropriate, and then that would inform their work going forward. And so I just wondered if we probably need to just expand on that one a little bit more. But yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Kaioi?
Tom, thanks. I have a comment to 3a. With regards to this question, I believe that the proposed actions are sufficient and appropriate in addressing the identified issues and challenges to achieve the project objective, with one exception. Paragraph 28 of the project proposal does not recognize that the IAASB has also an important public interest role to play in educating stakeholders about the inherent limitation of audits, which are real and cannot be wished away. So paragraph 28 should be augmented to reflect that role. This has been my comment. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. Sachika?
Thank you, Tom. First of all, with regard to the comment about Imran and Josephine's comment about the word explore in the action for more transparency in the auditor report, I actually support the explore wordings and also the explanation around that, because I think this action is a little bit different from other actions. Because it's, we need more exploration comparing to other action, because other action, we already have some thought about what will be the detailed action. But in this case, I think we don't have any specific action, but we need to explore it really. And other comment I have for other action is, one is about external confirmation, which is on 18F22. I support the action, but I think we also recognize the limitation of confirmation as well, and also need to remind the auditor that in some case there is collusion, particularly if there is a heightened risk, for example, between the entity and the confirming party. And I think we need to think about that in ongoing deliberation. And also with regard to the action relating to non-material fraud and third-party fraud, it's not a comment, but maybe more on a question to make sure my understanding is correct. Because I understand these actions are proposed within the auditor's responsibility to detect material misstatement with the financial statement, and does not go beyond. What I mean is that I think, we need to clarify and enhance our auditor's responsibility within the auditor's responsibility to detect material misstatement with the fraud. And I just would like to confirm, because I think it is very, very important for these two actions, particularly. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Wendy. Ida, were you coming in on this point, or was it that you're just, okay. Okay, Wendy?
Thank you, Tom. I just want to comment on a few things. We did send in quite a few editorial comments for consideration in this area. One about the specificity. The other I want to latch onto is we have overall concerns about the lack of a framework and the timing for the developing of non-authoritative guidance. In our discussions, I had that same number 9, and was concerned about the timing and what would get prioritized from other board discussions of, it in terms of staffing availability. It sounded a little bit to me like they would be done when there was time, and I'm not sure that all of them should be prioritized that way. So we recommend that the project proposal clarify how the guidance will be prioritized timely and consider whether or not, I also was concerned that maybe it was at the end, but also consider whether or not there could be some quick wins early on that could eventually, that could really help address some of the issues. And then it was hard to do group 1 and group 2 based on scrolling through all my comments. But the 18B first bullet on corroborating inquiries, we have some suggested changes to that language. Maybe consider that you might want to corroborate inquiries, fraud inquiries. And then we also had a comment on 18F. It's just in the wording, and because it sounds to me like we're suggesting it might be okay to rebut revenue. And I know in practice, we suggest that would be something extremely rare. So it's just in the words. I'm not necessarily saying that it shouldn't be there. It's just to switch the words around, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Yosh.
Thank you, Chair Tom. I have 2 comments about the non-material fraud. The number 19, page 16, agenda 3A. I am not fully grasping the intent of non-material fraud. When the fraud is identified, it may not be obvious whether it is material or not. The reason is whether it is qualitatively or quantitatively material should be determined as a result of identification and evaluation of its impact on the financial statements. So at the beginning of the identification, the fraud is not grasped by the material on non-material, I think. The second one is transparency. It's a different aspect from the transparency issue. The number 28, enhancing transparency of responsibilities and procedures regarding fraud in audit reports. I agree with the transparency in audit report, but I would like the working group to be careful not to become boilerplate and also avoid making the audit report longer and less understandable for users as a whole by this statement, I think. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Yosh. Isabel?
Yes, thank you. I have sent several detailed comments, but I will come back on point 28 on the transparency. In my written comment, I mentioned the need to include some scalability, but in fact, it's not really the word scalability that I wanted to use. I wanted to use the scope of this additional transparency requirement. Typically in the ISAs, we use differential requirements for communication. Sometimes for listed entities, we have additional communication requirements with who's charged with governance, or in the auditor's report with the key audit matters. We are exploring the fact of having maybe differential requirement for PI. So I think we should include as part of this reflection on additional transparency to which kind of entities it should apply, because I'm not sure it should apply to all. And just by the fact that we want to work on the link with key audit matters only apply to listed in the ISAs. So we have to be careful to know exactly where we are when we will draft the new requirements. Thank you.
Thanks, Isabel. Edo.
Thank you, Tom. Lynn, I've sent through some comments here and there, or in respect of the actions, but I also want to give a sense that we've gone through this in a fair amount of detail. And I think it's paramount that we do something to enhance and clarify, because performance is an issue every now and again, and that needs to be addressed. But I also want to express my interpretation based on the feedback received on the discussion paper and all the material that you presented to us, that I don't think that 240 is fundamentally flawed. And at some point, I do get the impression with the amount of time we spent on this, that we need to keep this in the right context. And I'm all for clarifying, enhancing requirements such that the auditors do indeed what they do. And if the responsibilities can be clarified, all the better. I do have some similar concerns in respect of non-authoritative guidance. I personally think that can be worked effectively immediately. We don't need to wait until the rest is done, because I think that would already help. Being very close to the discussion in the Netherlands about transparency in the auditor's report, and also how that discussion is developing and the struggles that the Dutch standard setter is having in coming up with the right words to bring scalability in, etc. I think exploring is indeed the right word in that context. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. I'd like to, we spent a lot of time on the word explore. And I happen to be someone who happens to be inclined to do something in this area at face value, but I am personally content with the word explore, because we are going to have a deliberation at this board in which options will be put to me. And if I'm not convinced that status quo is appropriate, then I believe it will be my responsibility as a board member to suggest some alternatives. So I guess I understand why some people want a stronger word, but explore is what we do on every topic. So I've listened to a lot of the debate today, and some of it has been about semantics of words, strengthen, enhance. I think we should have consistency in language, but we also have to understand that the due process is going to follow. And we have a lot of input to that. And I think we are inclined in certain directions based upon the evidence that we had. The NAG, as we're calling it now, we had a new acronym. So I feel like nagging us, but I will say that I happen to worry that non-authoritative guidance does take a lot of time. And I think the task, we should let the working group think through what is practically feasible based upon the timetable that we're going to set and agree to on this project, considering the public interest demands on it. And that's something they'll come back to us on, I guess, later this week and Monday. But yes, I think they should note the question is about our capacity. And that's what really will come down to, is our capacity to do it when the demand on requirements and application material in the actual standard itself probably takes precedence, at least in my mind. But I give them some ground to reconsider that, because I sort of agree that the list of issues in 23, obviously benefiting from all the comments we've had here today, can be refined, and then we could prioritize a little bit more about it. I personally would focus on the standards and guidance rather than the non-authoritative guidance, but we'll get a proposal back, and I think that the working group is well positioned to consider that. So there was a couple of points, and I turn it back to Lynn. What I suggest right now, we're past time already. I think that Lynn should try to bring today's discussion to conclusion. Tomorrow, I anticipate having some time, depending upon how the work plan discussion goes, to take some of that time at the end, and then maybe have to extend what was just a 2-hour session to complete this discussion on fraud. And I'll ask Lynn if you're agreeable to that proposal, because I don't want to truncate this important topic. at the board. I also understand it's late at night for some of our people on Zoom, and I want to make sure that we have effective dialogue here. Lynn? You're on mute.
Unmute. Thank you very much, Tom, and thanks everybody for those comments. I wanted to start on the last comment, and that was Edo's comment that U40 is not fundamentally flawed. And I think we need to keep that in mind in going forward in this project. Yes, we can enhance it. Yes, we can clarify it, but we are not making a wholesale change of a fundamentally different approach to an audit. Will these things make a difference? Well, I sincerely hope so, but we need to keep in mind that large parts of the standard are still extremely fit for purpose and work well. In terms of non-authoritative guidance, we thought we had enough caveats in the paper, but they may not have come through, that non-authoritative guidance will be done when and if resources are available. And certainly in the earlier half of next year, we do have additional resourcing on this project. And there are some pieces of non-authoritative guidance that don't require the standard setting before you do the guidance. And we would be thinking of potentially doing some of those, maybe in some FAQs or something else in that time period. Then there is a group of the non-authoritative guidance where you need to have a settled standard before you actually do revised standard before you do that non-authoritative guidance. On Explore, all of the work we have done suggests Explore is the right way to go on the auditor report. And we are going to bring that issue back very quickly to the March meeting when we have done some of that work. And I think I'm reading the meeting right, that the weight of opinion agrees with that Explore. But if that is not so, except for the one or two that have said they don't prefer Explore, it would be useful to hear it now or tomorrow in that session. And Tom, I agree, we only actually have two questions left. One is on the impact of the project and one is on, is there anything else? So I think they can be perfectly well done in up to a half-hour session tomorrow. And I don't think it will impact our turnaround either. However, before I commit Bev and the staff to this, I better just check with Bev whether there's anything you'd like to add.
I just wanted to give some context around the Explore and the reason for using it. There's 8 different ways that people have asked us to put transparency into the auditor's report. I'm not going to go through them or the numbers, but there's a clear, very wide range of options that we could have in that area. And that's what we need to explore is what option is most appropriate for the board. And that's hence some of the comments that we have in there. So I just wanted to provide that context. Thanks.
Thanks, Bev. And Tom, can I just conclude this session by thanking everybody for their comments and also thanking them for their written comments. And also a word of caution, we will do our very best to put in comments, particularly where there are multiple comments on the same issue. But we have, I think at last count, a couple of hundred comments. So we will not be able to put all of them in. We will be taking the substantive issues. So just to avoid disappointment among board members that their exact words aren't put in, we are having to do use our judgment as we go through. you will see substantial changes, but you will not see absolutely everything that every individual wanted. So, however, if you do have a fatal flaw with one of those issues, the earlier you can get it back to the working group and the staff, better, because nobody has currently said there's a fatal flaw in the project proposal. So if you do have, can we please know about it as soon as possible? Thanks, Tom. That concludes the session from my point of view.
So I'm able to grant you your wish on thanking people, but I can't let you conclude it yet because Josephine put her tent up.
I'm so sorry, Lynn. I just wanted to thank Bev, because once you explained that, that's a completely different aspect of this than I had interpreted. And I think it would be a great deal of help, certainly from my perspective, maybe others who are concerned about this terminology, if you could perhaps recast that piece in that manner, because you're saying in some ways, I'm interpreting that as, oh, we're still totally open to the idea of transparency. We just have to work out how best to deliver it in the auditor's report. And that's a very different way of, and that's perfectly acceptable when using the term explore, to also to Tom's point. So yeah, if you could recast it in that way, that would be a great help. Thank you.
Okay,
we'll look at that.
Okay, I see nods around the table. That would make me happier too. Billy, you're leaning over towards me to suggest that you'd like to come in.
Thanks, Tom. Yes, and sorry to change direction completely now from away from the technical, but Armand just asked me to just alert the board to the fact that those of you that are still going to join the dinner on Thursday evening, that you can make your payments by credit card. Remember, it's an $80 contribution to the dinner by credit card with Megan. Megan will be in the kitchen area immediately after the board meeting. Thank you.
Okay, that is a change of pace right now. And let me tell you, you can't explore the options related to that. You either pay it or you don't go. So it's quite binary. Okay, any other points that want to be raised about today's session? We'll have an opportunity to come back to this tomorrow. I think no one will doubt that there's been a lot of rigor, probably more rigor going into this project proposal than ever done before. And I think that will play out in terms of how we could advance the project. And so I think I feel really comfortable with that as a board charged with acting in the public interest. Okay, I'd like to close the session today. Thank you for sticking with us for an extra few minutes. Thank you for the public observers, official, and those following us on YouTube. We will start tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern time. We may, just for the public record, may extend slightly beyond the 2 hours, but not positive that we will. We'll take as much time as necessary to conclude the fraud project as well as the work plan discussions. And I'll bring this to a close. Now, are we off YouTube right now? Michelle?